I hope you're enjoying Take Back the Night. If you didn't already know, April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and that is why here at Respect on Campus, we put on this event every single year. Tonight, I will be showing you interviews with UCCS staff and students about what they feel about a whole host of topics. I hope you enjoy this video.
It's really important in a relationship to make sure you're very open with your partner about what your boundaries are and where you're comfortable. And it's also important that you hold yourself to your boundaries, because if you can't respect yourself, you can't expect the person you're with to respect you.
Well, consent to me is getting the approval, but when it is right or wrong completely depends on the situation. I think if you get the approval, you're good, but you shouldn't take advantage of it. I mean, if you're in a situation where both parties are intoxicated, I feel like you should take advantage of that. Healthy sex to me is definitely a mutual thing between the two parties. It is something meaningful and something that contributes to your overall emotional health as well as physical health.
So consent is any okay given by your partner to engage in sexual behavior or physical behavior, anything that needs permission. And every act that you do in a relationship needs some sort of permission from both parties. And consent can be verbal or consent can be physical. So just because your partner says it's okay, you have to watch for bodily signs. If you notice that they're tense or they're signaling to you and it's very clear that this is not okay, I'm not comfortable with this, and you should know what this looks like if you are in a romantic relationship with somebody, then you need to stop. It doesn't simply have to be no, it has to be bodily and it has to be verbal. You know if you have consent if you can clearly tell if your partner is comfortable. If they say yes, they don't even have to say yes, but you can tell that their body is comfortable in what they're doing, and when they say yes, it's not with any hesitation, so yes is not consent. Like this is not consent. You know if you have consent if your partner is 100% comfortable. Healthy sex is safe sex, and healthy sex is you being comfortable with doing what you're doing. And healthy sex is knowing your boundaries, engaging in those boundaries, and being able to articulate that you're comfortable or not comfortable with something. And protecting yourself and protecting the person that you're with.
So consent is saying yes every time you have sex with a partner, no matter if it's the first time or you've been dating for 4 years, you're married, whatever. Every single time you have to make sure that both parties involved are consensual and that they both want it as much as the other person does.
So my definition of consent would be when two people have an informal way of consenting that they can have sex with each other. And then healthy sex would be when those individuals are safe, have been tested, and it is consensual.
Yep, so consent, basically as far as Respect on Campus goes, it really means that no means no and yes means yes. So any kind of physical or just any kind of relationship in any situation, if it's sexual or whatever the case may be, if your partner says no, then you're not supposed to do anything. So no is no. And how do you know if you have consent? Well, it has to be verbal consent from that person before anything can take place. And how do you know if you don't have consent? Well, I mean, it's pretty, if obviously they haven't said yes to that, then that's not consent. If the person is drunk or if they're under the influence of any kind of drugs, then that's obviously no as well. Or if they just can't make any decisions for themselves. And healthy sex to me, well, I guess it's if you're with a person. For me, personally, it's if you're married to that person and obviously married and you have consent mutually between the two of you that that's okay.
Me.
Consent is when both parties agree on a certain sexual activity, and if one party doesn't agree, then you don't have consent. Healthy sex is when both parties want it and both parties agree to it, and if one party is not 100%, then it isn't healthy. And also you need to use protection such as birth control or condoms.
Consent is, it's more than just a yes or a no. It definitely relies on full capacity to understand. So if you're intoxicated, it's always a no. If someone's hesitant, it's a no. That consent it has to be full-fledged, and they have to be fully understanding of the situation.
So consent to me is both parties being of clear mind and making the consensual decision to do an act that is agreed upon while they both are able to make that decision without any barriers. How do you know if you have consent? You know that you have consent by both parties, again, being able to make that decision. They verbally say it. Usually if people are responsible enough, it's a long discussion that happens ahead of time. And then, how do you know if you don't have consent? If anybody's impaired in any way, if they've been using alcohol or drugs, even if they say yes, I don't believe that that's true consent because they're in an altered frame of mind. And what is healthy sex to you? Healthy sex is both parties being consensual, agreeing on the acts that are performed, and being of clear mind when they do so.
The next section of interviews is about being a bystander, what that means to our interviewees, and how you can be a good bystander, and maybe what are some of the challenges to being a bystander. We ask these faculty and students this because everybody is going to be a bystander to something or another during their life, and bystander behavior is critical. Oftentimes, the best predictor of a survivor recovering from their sexual assault experience is the care they receive from the first person they tell. Now, we know people want to be a bystander. In fact, a survey shows 80% of Americans feel that they would help given the situation, but what does it mean to really be a good bystander?
Okay. Being a bystander means that you're an active participant in everything that goes on around you. You're aware of what's going on, you're not afraid to intervene if needed, and you do so in a very educational and approachable manner as well. The biggest challenges to being a bystander is really getting the courage to step up and being that leader or that community person to not be afraid and be willing to step up and point out something that doesn't look right or to defend someone you may or may not know. So those are some of the biggest challenges.
So I think by being a bystander, I think one of the challenges that you face is that there's a level of uncertainty with what's going to happen. So for instance, if you are with a friend and you are witnessing something that's happening, you're much more likely to go and help them because they're your friend. But let's say if you're standing on the street and you see a stranger and you see something happening, you don't really necessarily associate with helping them because, again, there's that level of uncertainty. You don't really know what's going to happen, and you're putting your own life in danger. So I think you just have to ask yourself, like, if I was in this position, would someone help me? And so at the end of the day, like, you should always try and help that person. And maybe you don't go over and actively get involved, but it's calling for help or letting somebody else know or finding other people who are on the street and approaching it together. I think that's the most appropriate way to be a bystander, especially if you're dealing with somebody you don't know. But obviously, if it's a friend, your automatic response is to try and help them.
In my opinion, what the biggest challenges are to being a bystander are that you need to really do the right thing, and at times that can feel difficult and challenging. And doing the right thing is not always the easy thing, but it's the right thing. So I think that's challenging, but I think it's the right thing for bystanders to do.
In my opinion, the biggest challenges of being a bystander would be that just to be watching something happen, and it could be hurtful to others, and that would just be like a conscious choice of not stepping in to do the right thing or not having the courage to step in when others would need you to.
Okay, so my view on bystanders is that there's definitely situations where they can be good. It's just as to what you should do and how you should go about it. And obviously violent bystanding is not the best option, but there are definitely milder ways of being a bystander. Like you could call the police, for instance, or you could, just subtly talk to someone else about that might have a little bit more control of the situation. And it can be bigger, and it can involve argumentative conversations, but it doesn't have to be always a huge fight to stop some girl from going home with some guy because he's drunk. It can be solved other ways. And bystanders can definitely be good in different ways. So that is my general understanding and my view of bystanders.
What you can do is probably tell someone else that you know, or maybe, like an authority, call the cops, anything like that, because then you don't get directly involved, so you don't get in trouble, or you don't have any backlash from whoever was assaulting the other person, but you can still get help from the person. So,
what do you have to do to intervene as a bystander? You can either get somebody who's close to you to help you out to dissolve the situation, or you could call the authorities and have them take care of it if it's too dangerous for you or anybody else around you.
I think that's tricky. I think, especially when it comes to people that you're in relationships with, whether it's a friendship or anything like that, you really have to tread lightly on the situation because you don't want to make any snap decisions on how to handle the situation. My experience with it was that I had a best friend of 8 years that had gotten into an abusive relationship. To my knowledge, it never became physically abusive, but it was extremely emotionally abusive. And when I finally stepped in and had to threaten to call the cops to encourage this guy to leave her apartment, she seemed grateful in the moment, but as soon as they ultimately got back together, she cut me out of her life, and our friendship of 8 years went completely down the drain. So you just have to be careful with it when you are talking about being a good bystander. It just depends on who you're talking about, I guess.
So I think that being a bystander is actually probably really difficult because we all have a propensity not to want to get involved. I think it's important for people to know the resources that they should call or who they can talk to, especially if they see something happening on campus. I think one of the reasons that people might shy away from it is because they don't know, and it can be really scary. I think that if I had a friend who was sexually assaulted, I would have a immediate desire to really want to, prosecute and find out and go through the legal channels. But I think taking your friend's perspective and their actual experience into consideration is probably the best advice I can give, or the most important thing to do is really consider your friend rather than what you want to do for them, but what they want to do. And I think that's probably the best thing I could say to do.